All right, welcome to Tougie's Take, episode 15. This is the day after the NHL trade deadline, the day where we did nothing for roughly 15 hours, and then Anthony Mantha got traded. I hope you didn't fall asleep in front of your couch. Tougie, how are you doing?
In front of your couch. You got so bored at looking at the TV, you turned to watch the couch.
Yeah, either that or you just fell asleep so hard you slumped off onto the floor.
All right, well, we have an intro now, don't we?
We do.
This is the intro now. This is the intro now. This is the intro now. It sounds good.
Okay, so I think this week, I know we had a lot of you turn in for the live show. Some good, some bad. Really, it depended on what team you were a fan of and the experience. But I think the best thing we can do right now, other than discuss the only piece of news in the NHL, which is that Patrick Laine discovered that he can play hockey for all of 15 seconds, is that we can go through the teams one by one. Not necessarily even all the teams. Some teams just didn't show up yesterday. They forgot in a very Dale Talon-esque manner. And we'll just figure out who won yesterday, who lost, who should have made more moves, who made the right moves, who made the wrong moves. And this is going to have heavy weight on our GM awards, I think.
So again, a friendly reminder that before we really get into today's show, there totally wasn't a nasty edit there. Don't worry about it. That you can catch the live show that Deej and I did on Monday in full, youtube.com/Tougie24. If you want to hear our thoughts in the moment, we'll get back to our regularly scheduled programming later on in the week with our viewer questions and, of course, other things going on around the hockey world. There is a lot that we could talk about. Surprise, surprise, the Memorial Cup was canceled today, but again, we'll talk about that stuff later in the week. And obviously with viewer questions, what do people want to talk about? What we're already going to talk about. So what's the point? So like Deej said, we'll pretty much go through every team here. I think, Deej, even some of the teams that didn't do anything, it is a talking point for a lot of those teams that stood pat. So I will leave it up to you. We can get right down to business on today's show. Where do you want to go first? What division and what team are we starting off with?
Let's see. So I think let's start it out with the West Division, because the West Division, I feel like there were not a lot of impactful moves. Colorado obviously made some value plays, but I thought we would definitely see a lot more movement amongst the big four, or really big three, and then a couple other guys of the West Division.
Right. So I guess we'll start off with Colorado, which I don't know if we want to hand out a letter grade. For the most part, I feel like it's a winner, an indifferent, or a loser. Colorado, though, I name as a winner. And granted, they didn't make the biggest moves in the world. They picked up Patrick Nemeth from Detroit. They picked up Devan Dubnyk as well. And they brought back Carl Soderberg. And all three of those deals, they didn't give up major pieces. Greg Pateryn, who's a depth NHL defenseman. Josh Dickinson, who's an ECHLer. Ryder Ralston, freshly drafted this year, I think 5th or 6th round pick. And then you give up a 4th and a 5th over the next 2 years. Very, very little to get a phenomenal defensive defenseman in Nemeth who can help make up ground for Eric Johnson's injury troubles. Devan Dubnyk, we have no idea what he's going to be, but you look now at Colorado, and they're one of those teams where if they're healthy, they have 4 guys that could realistically play goal for them heading into the playoffs. And then Carl Soderberg is bottom 6 forward depth. It's a team that I don't really think had a ton of cap space to really make a ton of moves in the first place. But the moves that they made, they shored up defensively. They didn't really need that big star acquisition to boost up the offense or anything. And the defensive core is already disgustingly good. I give Colorado a passing grade here for sure with the cap space that they had to work with and adding where they needed to add, which again was and thankfully for them, the lower level spots. They didn't need that big fish addition.
Yeah, I guess, and even if we move back the beginning of their trades to March 20th, that Jonas Johansson trade where they supposedly got Buffalo's worst goaltender for a sixth, and then he just shows up and starts playing like an absolute stud. I don't think Colorado made a single bad trade here. They did load up on goalies, which is not necessarily odd, but I would say unexpected, given that their goalies have been pretty solid this year. But it looks like they added where they needed to.
And I'd say Joe Sakic's very much in the running for GM of the year at this point for what he's done. Really over the last, since last October, I'd say, around the time you expected the last season to start. Obviously, the addition of Devon Taves, and then, of course, bringing in Brandon Saad as well. So I think Joe Sakic has only added to his, to his incredible tenure in Colorado right now, especially because it's just been in the past few years, right, where it went from what the hell is Joe Sakic doing to, oh my God, they've built a juggernaut here. So, passing grade for me for Colorado for sure.
Yeah. So then I guess we'll go to the next. This team only made one trade at the deadline, albeit a complicated one to follow.
Yeah.
But I guess it essentially ends up being a 2, 3, and a 5 for Matthias Janmark, Nick DeSimone, and another 5. So basically just a second and a third for those two.
I will shout out. I don't know if I think it's Nick DeSimone, but I really hope
it's 100% Nick DeSimone.
I really hope it's DeSimone because that sounds
it is 100%
so
Nick DeSimone.
For Vegas, not to throw you under the bus there, partner. It was too good to ignore.
We've never heard of DeSimone seeds?
Yeah. Vegas was in a really tough spot cap-wise, obviously. I think we all knew that. You don't add Alex Pietrangelo for almost $9 million and hold on to Marc-Andre Fleury and Robin Leonard, which turned out to be an amazing decision, by the way. Remember how much one Kelly McCrimmon was getting thrown under the bus for not trading Marc-Andre Fleury. It was an amazing decision to keep him. Janmark's not the biggest difference maker on paper. Better defensively. The offensive numbers have fallen off since he first joined the league, but he's on Vegas, and who knows what he might be now on a bit of a rejuvenated team. And even if he is, a solid third line addition, it's tough to say that Vegas doesn't necessarily need a little bit of a boost in that department if you're going to be relying on guys. I don't know, like in terms of the bottom six, right? They don't have what we'll call the sexiest names in the world where people are like, oh yeah, these are the perennial fourth liners that'll get the job done. I don't know how many people are freaking out about Keegan Kolesar, William Carrier, guys like that, but they have been effective tools for Vegas. So I don't know if I'll give him a passing grade. I'll give it a little bit of an indifference. I feel like it was a little bit much to pay for Janmark, but obviously the reason for giving up the draft picks is we saw this a ton throughout this deadline. 3-team trades where we see double retention. So Vegas, for example, Matthias Janmark's original cap hit on Chicago for this season was 2.25. Vegas, the cap hit for them is $562,000 because of the double retention, and that's why you pay a lot. And obviously, we'll talk about that with the likes of Toronto later on as well. So, a decent price to pay. It's very obvious that they liked Janmark specifically because you wouldn't pay that much for someone who's viewed as kind of a middle-of-the-road guy. So we'll see how it pans out. I'm going to go indifferent for the moment. I don't think you can call them losers outright. You can argue that they needed to do more to keep pace with Colorado, but also it's a team that had a little bit more limitations, I feel like, than the Avalanche did heading into deadline day.
Yeah, I got to agree. The Vegas tends to get a lot of value out of those defense first guys. So, maybe Kelly McCrimmon's looking at Janmark and it's like, oh my God, that we need to plug this guy in right here. And this is the way to go. And them only making one move is actually a significant improvement over, and this still baffles me, the Minnesota Wild didn't do anything.
So this was something that was mentioned. God, and I forget what GM it was. I think it was Edmonton, formerly Detroit. His name is just totally escaping me right now, and I hate this. Oh my God. It's the worst. I'm drowning.
It's allergy season. Straight to the brain.
I'm drowning.
Ken Holland.
Ken Holland. I think he was quoted today in saying that, hey, guess what? You can't go for it every year. Yeah, here it is from Chris Johnson. From Ken Holland, quote, I don't think you can be all in every year. I think you have to pick and choose. I think this was the year that Minnesota decided to pick and choose, right? Like you're freshly back into being
I don't think it's a bad decision.
Right. That's the thing, though, right? Like you're freshly back into being a team that is viewed as, oh, hey, they might not automatically lose in the first round if they make it. No disrespect, Wild fans, but that's been the reputation. And I look at Minnesota. There's no doubt. Could they have added to this team? Yes. Would it have been the right call, though? I genuinely don't know. I mean, for me, I think they're right in that indifferent category where I wouldn't name them winners or losers at this stage. I think Bill Guerin probably did the right thing, and being a little bit hesitant here because Minnesota has 2 first-round and third-round picks this year. Both of those extra picks are from Pittsburgh, from the Jason Zucker trade. So, you look at a team right now that's turning the corner. Are they able to outright compete with Vegas and Colorado? I don't think so. I don't think there's anybody you could have added at the deadline who would have really locked in this core to say, all right, it's worth it to push and go for it now, like we saw teams in other divisions do, specifically in the North Division. So I agree. I think they could have added to this team. And who knows, maybe they do make the run all the way. But I see what Bill Guerin was thinking here with let's not jump at our first opportunity. Let's not let our eyes be bigger than our stomachs, essentially, and try to bite off more than we can chew at this stage. Let's have a bit of composure, give it time, and know that if we keep on this track and draft well, I mean, this year, obviously, it's a real toss-up, but this is a team that, I think could have, continued sustained success that they didn't need to gamble away this trade deadline.
I agree. Minnesota they are looking at some cap problems. I mean, it's nowhere near as bad as San Jose, but when you've got $27 million wrapped up in Jonas Brodin, Matt Dumba, Ryan Suter, and Jared Spurgeon. Obviously, that's not great. Like a bunch of guys come off the books for them this year. They're still paying Parisi $7.5 a year. They're paying Matt Zuccarello $6 million until 2024. And then next year you got to pay Kevin Fiala and this is the real kick in the nuts, Kirill Kaprizov.
Yeah, so Marcus Johansson and Nick Bonino, as well as Ian Cole, those deals all come off the books. That's over $10 million right there. That is your Fiala Kaprizov money. There's been so much smoke around Matt Dumba that there has to be a fire there, and that he'll probably be traded this offseason, is my guess. So again, that says to me as to why Bill Guerin was so hesitant here. I still think that there are other moves to be made with this roster before it's where Guerin wants it to be to say, okay, now at the deadline, we go out and make moves. So I think Minnesota fans, they're going to make the playoffs. That is almost a certainty at this point. And I think that's a win. If they win a playoff series, that's a huge win. Granted, you're looking at probably having to face Vegas in the first round if the standings hold. Yikes, but who knows what you pull off. So really right now they're playing with house money with the roster that they have already, and I think they do have a plan moving forward. So Minnesota is one of those teams, and I said I think there'd be some interesting ones where they didn't do anything, but I don't necessarily think that's the wrong move.
Yeah, I mean, I got to agree. And now in the West, you kind of get into a weird spot right now where there is such a drop off. You get some teams here that probably should have been sellers, but also weren't buyers. So I like what St. Louis did here, where they didn't make any moves, because they're very much a borderline team, even with all the moves they made in the offseason, the Mike Hoffman, Torrey Krug acquisitions. And they're very much a borderline team this year. I don't think there is a right move here for St. Louis, so they stayed put. And I think that is the right move.
When you first started to allude towards that being your viewpoint, I'm like, I disagree. But as you went along, I thought about it. And I think you're right. I think it was the right move for them because of those moves they made in the offseason. You mentioned bringing in Torrey Krug, Mike Hoffman. Those were, in effect, your deadline moves. This core needs to show you that it's either good enough or not. If they make the playoffs, you can't convince me that the St. Louis Blues aren't capable of going on a run. Even if it is facing Colorado in the first round, I look at this roster and I say, this is a team that could win the Cup. And maybe it's just because 2019 is so fresh in my memory that I could see that happening. But at the end of the day, too, they've struggled this season. So I think, all things considered, if you're Doug Armstrong in St. Louis, I need to see what this team is before I risk adding to it or pulling it apart a little bit. So I agree. St. Louis is one of those teams where I think Blues fans might have been pretty frustrated by the lack of moves. They haven't made a trade since the draft last October, which is still a very weird sentence to say. But I think aside from the one move I would have made was a backup goalie, because I have been banging that drum all season long. Ville Husso is not good enough to be your backup goaltender. And again, as of today, he has an .887 in 14 games played. I think that's the one thing that you might have needed to take a little bit of pressure off of Binnington's shoulders. You look at that forward core. Tarasenko hasn't played the full season. I think that forward core can piece it together. Defensively as well, I think they have some good pieces in place that could get it done. But I think for the back stretch here of the regular season, really over the next month, of course, the season ends in the middle of May, I think you really needed a backup goalie at the very least. And, goalies weren't exactly going for all that much. We saw Dave Riddick go to Toronto for a third-round pick, if I'm not mistaken. So I agree that major moves in terms of addition or subtraction, probably not the way to go. But I am leaning towards it being closer to a fail than an indifference, just because I think there was a cheap move that you could have made there that in theory would have given this team a better shot to keep their heads above water, knowing that in this West Division right now, they're only a point above Arizona. They're on 44 points in 41 games. Arizona's on 43 and 43, actually. So 1 point with 2 games at hand over Arizona. But San Jose is only 4 points back of St. Louis. Equal amount of games played. It is not out of the realm of possibility that the San Jose Sharks could make the playoffs. Even the LA Kings, I'd say, have a fringe chance if they go on a run like they did earlier in the season. The only team that's out of it in the West is Anaheim. So, again, you talk about a pass, an indifferent, a fail. It's somewhere in the middle for me between indifferent and fail for St. Louis, just because I don't see why they didn't go for a backup goaltender.
Especially, so it's interesting, and I really like that you mentioned that St. Louis has played 41 games, because I think it's too easy to forget that in that 2018-2019 Cup season for them, they, after 41 games, were tied with the Florida Panthers for last place in the league. And then they turned it around the second half and they won the Cup. Now this year, there's only 15 games left in the season and they're in a playoff spot. The roster's pretty close to what you won a Cup with, give or take, obviously Pietrangelo, and then losing Jake Allen to Montreal, like you said, left a huge hole at backup goalie, especially with Binnington kind of struggling ever since that season. I got to agree with you. This is a little closer to a fail than a pass, but not necessarily a hard line either way.
Yeah, and the weird thing is, though, too, I think it was a deal that they could have probably put together pretty easily. I don't think it would have been all that difficult to go out and get a goaltender. And right now I'm trying to bring up the list of goalies that are, say, UFAs, for example, because I'm sure people will be like, well, who? And, in terms of cheaper options, or maybe not so cheap, but Jonathan Bernier in Detroit maybe possibly could have worked for you. I mean, Philadelphia, call about Brian Elliott and bringing him back to St. Louis. Call. I'm not saying it's the right deal, and maybe Philly wouldn't have parted with him, but it was an option. I probably wouldn't bring Ryan Miller back to St. Louis. That would be that'd be a bit of a weird one. Aaron Dell in New Jersey. He hasn't played all that much, but give him a shot. I think there were cheap options. Even Calvin Pickard in Detroit. I think there were cheap options out there that you could have gone for, but I digress. The team that we just mentioned as well that are very much close with them, Deej, the Arizona Coyotes also did not do anything at this deadline. And I think they're in a real similar spot as St. Louis, but I'd be drifting even more towards picking apart pieces of this team at this stage. It's a tough call because obviously I think you look at St. Louis and you say, like you mentioned, there's a lot of pieces on this team that won a cup not all that long ago. For the Coyotes at this stage, though, you don't have a first-round pick. You have 2 seconds. You have one from Columbus, and you don't have your own third. I think if you're the Arizona Coyotes, now would have been the right time to trade off as many pieces as you could to try and recoup some draft capital here coming up. Because even if you make the first round, I mean, you're telling me like, St. Louis, can they compete with Colorado? I think yes. Can the Arizona Coyotes upset the Colorado Avalanche in round 1? I mean, I don't know about you, but just the discomfort in my chest that I felt as I said that, I don't think so. I just don't see it. So, man, if it was retaining salary on Goligoski, Hjalmarsson, Jason Demers, we talked about that defense core so many times, most of it, all but 2 guys being up at the end of the season. I think there were moves you could make, and the fact is...
your 2 best guys, too.
Yeah, and the fact is right now, Ivan Prosvetov got the start last night for the Coyotes. Aiden Hill is the other active goaltender. Both Kemper and Ranta are on IR. As of recording on this podcast, according to Cap Friendly. So, honestly, for Arizona, I give it a fail because I think there were pieces that you could strip away to get a little bit more in terms of the draft. I don't think there was any piece that you could necessarily add that would have increased your chances of making it out of the first round. Not to mention, I mean, they're 8 points back of Minnesota for third, and Minnesota has 3 games at hand. I have to give the Minnesota Wild a failing grade here. It's clear that this roster is a fringe playoff team at best, and barring the
Coyotes, just to reiterate, I'm losing it too.
Barring a drastic...
Definitely said Minnesota Wild.
Oh, did I?
But it's fine.
There you go. Barring a drastic upset
just in case somebody listening spaced out at work.
Fair enough.
They're like, what's going on?
It's been a long 24 hours, okay? It has been.
It really has.
At the end of the day, I just don't see Arizona being able to compete with Colorado at the top. So I'm going to give them my first fail at this stage. I genuinely think this roster has shown you that it doesn't quite deserve that same level of respect that St. Louis does in terms of, well, if they make it, we'll see.
Yeah, so I feel so weird about Arizona right now as a team on the whole, and I don't know what I would have done at the trade deadline, but what I do know about Arizona is based on your Ekman Larson, your Jacob Chikrin, your Clayton Keller, your Nick Schmaltz, your Christian Dvorak, and to a lesser extent, Phil Kessel contracts, your core is in place. You are committed to your core. You are not a rebuilding team. Obviously, you'll have a chance to retool here in the offseason, but at what point do you get your core some help? Because there's no shedding some of those contracts anytime soon if you're trying to rebuild Arizona. So obviously, what do you do if these guys aren't working out? You try and get some help at the deadline. Although, to be fair, I saw the Florida Panthers do that for 5-6 years in a row, never make the playoffs, and continually deplete ourselves of assets. So I'm going to say indifferent on Arizona.
I mean, that's fair, too. And we talked about that quite a bit, right? Where it's how do you put that fan base through another retooling? and keep spirits up. So I'm with you on that. I'm still going to lean towards the failing grade here personally. I want to move on, though, to San Jose. Like I mentioned, they're back within striking distance. They had a very active deadline period, 5 trades over the course of the final 2 to 3 days of the deadline. They started off with the previously aforementioned Devin Dubnyk trade to Colorado, where they picked up Greg Pateryn in a 5th. They were involved in the trade that sent Nick Foligno to Toronto, as they retained 50% of Foligno's salary and picked up a 4th-round pick for doing so. They got a much-needed goaltender into the system by sending Freddie Claesson to Tampa for goaltender Magnus Krona. It might be Trona. I'm not sure. He's Swedish, so you never quite know. He was a 5th-round pick of the Lightning back in 2018, currently unsigned, went to the University of Denver. But again, a team that really needed some goaltending tools in the system. They also picked up a free 5th-round pick for retaining salary on Janmark in that deal, and a 1-for-1 sending Antti Suomela to Toronto for Alex Barabanov. So I know a lot of Sharks fans that are actually very happy with what Doug Wilson did here, being a third party in a lot of these trades. And really, I mean, if you look at it, what did they do? You got a 5th-rounder, a 4th-rounder, another 5th-rounder. Tough to be overly excited about that, but you get a goalie for the future, and you get someone in Alex Barabanov who looked like he was on the cusp of maybe putting it together for the Leafs. Didn't quite happen. It made sense for Toronto to move on from him and give him a shot at the NHL level. San Jose always ends up with players like this guy anyway, because they have to, because of the cap that they have dished out to certain teams. It's tough because I certainly can't label it a fail, right? Certainly not. Is it a passing grade? I mean, I didn't expect this team to add because, again, they're a fringe playoff team, and I don't think that if you add to this team, suddenly, again, they're right there with Colorado in contention for, knocking off the top team and making a run in the playoffs. I don't think that's the case. Did I necessarily expect them to sell either when there's the chance of making the playoffs right now? No. They were in that really weird spot where you just say, let it ride and see what happens. But I'll admit I'm indifferent because, yes, Doug Wilson did well being a third party. Yes, he's done well drafting in the lower rounds in the past. But I'm sorry, Sharks fans, from an outside perspective, I refuse to be overly excited about a 4th and 2 5th-round picks.
Yeah. There's something funny to me about a team as horrifically embattled against the cap as San Jose being able to just straight up acquire salary for picks. Like, they found room for it. I say they kind of moved the pieces they could move. They moved Devin Dubnyk. They moved Stefan Neusen. There wasn't a lot to do here. And then they acquired Magnus Krona, who I'm unofficially nicknaming Big Time, which I believe is the Latin translation of that. So Magnus Krona, Big Time, they get him. They're just, I don't know, your team, the San Jose Sharks are stuck in mud. There's only so much they can do. There's not a lot of wiggle room because of the cap. Nobody really wants most of the players that are on bad contracts. So they got rid of the ones they could. They acquired what they could, which was a 4th and a 5th, and they did some salary. I'm going to give them a pass, not because that their moves were incredibly impactful, but because they made the most of what little resources they have.
Fair. That is fair. And I'll mention this too. They're retaining about 1.9, close to $2 million worth of salary between the Foligno and Janmark deals. So you're right. I mean, they did make the most of what they had. So, I mean, I'd certainly trend it more towards a pass than a fail. But for me, I'm still somewhere in the middle with San Jose there. I mean, again, if you want to say it's a pass because they made the most of the very little wiggle room that they had, that's fair enough. And I respect that. But you talk about San Jose, and it's one of those things where do they have to probably make a major move or two? Yes, but obviously those are more likely to happen in the offseason. So, I mean, fair enough, DJ. I think you're trending me closer to a passing grade. But also, again, we got to keep it in perspective that all they did was pick up very, very low draft picks. So, moving on then to the LA Kings, 2 teams left in this division. The Kings were I mean, they didn't really do much. They were somewhat active towards the end of March with the Lemieux and Christian Melanin acquisitions. The big trade here that we saw was sending Jeff Carter to the Pittsburgh Penguins for a conditional third in 2022 and a conditional fourth in 2023. So the 2022 third rounder becomes a second if the Penguins get to the Stanley Cup final and Carter plays in at least 50% of the games, which, all right, that's a third round pick is what we've learned. And that fourth round pick can become a third rounder if Carter plays in at least 50 games next season. So we'll see what happens there. The news was today, unlike the majority of Penguins fans expecting this, Jeff Carter said he plans on playing next season and is under contract next season as well. So, there's a decent shot there. And I think that condition was kind of the dead giveaway that, hey, these teams expect that Jeff Carter will probably play next year if there's a condition in relation to next season. It was one of those interesting moves for the Penguins. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. But for the Kings here, Deej, I mean, not really all that bad of a move. I can't look at them with any sort of fault here. You could talk about whether or not they had other pieces that they could have potentially moved on from, but there wasn't anybody else that was an obvious shout, I would say. I mean, Jeff Carter is one of those guys, too, that wasn't on an expiring contract. It would have had to have been a similar deal for someone like Dustin Brown, who's also under contract for next season. So it's an interesting spot there for the Kings at this stage where they do have a ton of cap space, even though they're technically on the books here for a $6.25 terminated contract, $6.25 million contract of Ilya Kovalchuk's that was terminated. And also Mike Richards still counts against their cap as well for the next couple of seasons at least. So they're a team that has an interesting amount of cap, an interesting amount of dead cap with retained salary to Jeff Carter. The Dion Phaneuf buyout is $4 million this year and $1 million for the next two. So they're an interesting team in terms of that cap space, but I can't really say I'm all that surprised they didn't move on from anybody else. I mean, Dustin Brown, like I said, was the obvious shout. And the move that they did make was re-signing Alex Iafallo, which I thought was a good call. 4x4, I believe it was. That's a pretty damn good deal for Iafallo. So I don't hate that at all for the Kings either. So honestly, I'm trending towards the same spot as San Jose, probably somewhere in the middle of a pass to indifference. I think they did pretty well maintaining Iafallo, getting rid of Carter. They could have done a little bit more that would have made this a very obvious win, though, had they found something for Dustin Brown. But I guess the market just wasn't there.
Yeah. This team's weird, right? Like 2 weeks ago, they were kind of, oh, hey, they may have the ability to make a run here. They went out, they acquired Brendan Lemieux for a fourth. And then, there was obviously the Mike Amadio trade and then the Jeff Carter move, which has like a lot of conditions. They really worked that one out. I like this Jeff Carter move for Pittsburgh. Obviously, this is good for the Kings. They're still going to be in what I'll call cap hell for one more year after this. I don't necessarily find the move confusing. Obviously, if the Penguins don't make the final here and you just end up with a third and a fourth, that's almost no value. But it's not like you're going to do anything with Jeff Carter here anyway. So, I'll give them an indifferent towards a pass. There were some other players that I think they could have shed here and really knocked it out of the park. But, next year is not the year to make your fan base suffer without any stars when you still have all those guys on the books. So,
right.
I like what LA did.
I'll say this, too, for Rob Blake. He's done a decent job. They have an extra second and third this year, too, from St. Louis and Toronto. That St. Louis pick has bounced around a lot. It was technically in the Alec Martinez trade, though. So, yeah, that pick's bounced around a lot. It was originally, oh, my God, I'm just looking at the I guess we'll call it the trade tree here. That second-round pick from St. Louis went to Buffalo as a part of the Ryan O'Reilly trade, then went to Vegas as a part of the Colin Miller trade, and then to LA as a part of the Alec Martinez trade. So that second-round pick they have was originally a part of the Ryan O'Reilly trade. So that's a bit of a weird one. I guess we'll move on to Anaheim, although I did want to say with San Jose, now that they traded Devin Dubnyk, their backup is Josef Koronar. So another team where it's like, okay, you're going to ride Martin Jones to try and make the playoffs. Have fun with that. The Anaheim Ducks, though.
Marty J.
The Anaheim Ducks made 2 trades at the deadline, sending Ben Hutton to Toronto for a 2022 fifth-round pick. Again, a common trend of a lot of teams moving picks for next year, of course, where there'll be a little bit more sense of normalcy. They also acquired Hayden Fleury from Carolina in exchange for Yanni Hakanpää and a 6th-round pick in 2022. So they bring in a 5th-round pick for Ben Hutton, which was good. Ben Hutton wasn't really going to do much there. He'll be a good depth defenseman for the Leafs. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. And they bring in Hayden Fleury, who is kind of the X factor here. Hakanpää, a bit older, more of a defensive defenseman. Hayden Fleury on the outs in Carolina clearly needed a change of scenery to try and get something going. And I think Anaheim is a pretty good spot for him to try to do that with a lot of younger players on that core. I mean, Fleury's 24 at this stage, and he's an average defenseman. It's time to find out if there's a little bit more to his game. And I know some Ducks fans are saying, yay, another average defenseman, but hey, Hayden Fleury might have a little bit more to show here, and he'll get an opportunity in Anaheim that he just wasn't going to get in Carolina at this stage. So it's another team where, again, I don't think it's a home run. I'm somewhere in between a win and a bit of indifference at this stage, because with this team, you did have the questions, and again, of certain players that you could have moved on from. There was the talk about Ryan Getzlaf, whether or not that was realistic or not. There was also the talk of Rickard Rakell and whether or not that was going to happen as well, although he's under contract for next season as well. I mean, aside from that, it would have been a bit tough to trade someone like Danton Heinen, who's an RFA next year, because, of course, teams want the certainty of, hey, we have negotiating power here, where, with RFAs a lot of times, if you acquire them, they're going to say, oh, well, I have you where I want you here in negotiating because you actively wanted to pick me up. So, again, not a home run for Anaheim due to holding on to the likes of Getzlaf and Rakell for me. Josh Manson as well. His name was out there quite a bit. So, pun intended, the Ducks could have made a bigger splash here, so I can't name it a bigger win for them, but they did okay.
Apparently, and this news came out yesterday, they were very close to sending Getzlaf to Vegas, and just the price was too high. I can't remember who reported that, but it was a pointed discussion yesterday. So I'll say that's an L. But a huge W for them is if you rewind this a few weeks, when they got Alexander Volkov from Tampa Bay, who is just another guy that's a talented goal scorer that's stuck in Tampa's bottom 6. We saw it with Marchessault, we saw it with Carter Verhaeghe, and apparently now Alexander Volkov, who has 3 goals in 6 games with the Ducks. So, that's a win. Not being able to trade the other guys is a loss. I'm kind of indifferent on the Ducks.
Fair enough. So that is the West Division wrapped up. Deej, where do you want to go next?
Well, let's see here. Let's go ahead and hit the Central before we hit... Well, I guess there's huge acquisitions in all 3 of the remaining...
Yes. Yes, there is.
Let's just go in the order that NHL.com has them listed. So we'll go with the Scotia North next.
The Scotia. So it leads us to the most interesting team here, and that is the Ottawa Senators. We'll start at the bottom. With Ottawa, they had a decently active deadline here, Deech, as they sent Braden Coburn to the Islanders for a 7th-rounder next year, Mike Riley to Boston for a 3rd-rounder next year, and Eric Goodbranson to Nashville for a 2023 7th-rounder and defenseman Brandon Fortunato. Again, not exactly a major win here. I mean, Fortunato, for the record, is a 24-year-old defenseman who has 9 career AHL games, so the odds are certainly against him. But for the Sens, I mean, again, not the biggest haul in the world, a 3rd and 2 7ths, but they did something, at least. I do think there were other pieces that maybe you could have sent out, but not to the same extent as in Anaheim, for example. I mean, I don't know what you would have gotten for an Artem Anisimov, and you're probably going to keep Ryan Dzingel around. So some limited options in terms of assets that you could have sold off. Somehow you got something for Eric Branson. And Ottawa at this stage, I mean, 2 second-rounders over the next 2 years. They have an extra third rounder next year as well from Boston now, thanks to the Mike Riley trade. So they're set up in a pretty interesting way. Again, I don't think it's a home run for Pierre Dorion, but certainly not a failing grade at all here. So I have him somewhere in the middle for Dorion and the Ottawa Senators.
Yeah, I've got him in the middle too. This team obviously should be a seller, but they've really got nothing to sell.
Yeah, so, that's the big issue, right?
They did what they could. Roster. Yeah, I mean, they got $5 million on the books from buyouts too coming up off this year. I mean, that only goes down to about $4 million next year. But yeah, I don't know what you do. I don't know what you would have done here if you were Ottawa. I mean, there's obviously Dzingel and Anisimov are really the only two UFAs you could have gotten rid of. Well, I'm actually surprised they didn't flip Dzingel for a couple of picks. I feel like they could have gotten a second and a third.
Yeah, I think maybe if they're planning on re-signing him, a show of loyalty. Now, I will say this, though. While it's not directly intertwined with deadline day, they did make a move that I absolutely commend them for making, even though it was clearly the most obvious move in the world to make, and that was picking up Victor Mete on waivers from Montreal. So in terms of that, if you want to include that as a part of deadline day, I would consider that a win. I don't, because again, it's a waiver move, but if you look at the general picture now here for the Sens, I really do like that move for them. And it's interesting that Buffalo decided not to. I believe Buffalo, of course, had the jump on them in the waiver wire. Interesting that the Sabres elected not to do that. But for Sens fans right now, I mean, I'm excited to see what Victor Mete can do for them. I mean, it's someone who's a bit of an analytical darling that never really got that full-time shot with Montreal and just never really seemed to fit what they were going for in terms of team building. So we'll see what happens there. But I think the optimism around the Senators continues for now.
Yeah, I agree. So we'll go up a rank. We'll look at Vancouver, who are primarily sellers here. Although, were they really sellers when you look at this? It's a very bizarre set of decisions. And I think Jim Benning may have done his last deal.
Jim Benning has to be on borrowed time. He has to be. To just talk about the trades really quickly. He flipped Adam Gaudette to Chicago for Matthew Highmore. That's two fringe NHLers for one another. That's fine. Sorry, Canucks fans, to break your hearts, but I'm sure you've come to the realization that it just wasn't quite, it just wasn't quite going to happen with Adam Gaudette. And I know that was a player with a lot of hype, and rightfully so. He had 60 points in 38 games in his last NCAA season. But it's clear it just wasn't happening at this stage. And it sucks because that's someone who had 33 points for you in the regular season last year. So, again, that's a bit heartbreaking. They then send a 4th-round pick to Chicago this year for Madison Bowie and a 5th. I am unaware of any updated metrics or numbers on Madison Bowie because he hasn't really played this season. His metrics heading into this season were a disaster. So I don't understand this, aside from the fact that he's a former Kelowna Rocket, and maybe you're like, we can fix him, which, okay. And then you flip Jordy Ben to Winnipeg for a 6th-round pick this year. So, you look at those deals, there's nothing major. You can't really call the Jordy Ben trade a win because, again, it's someone who was gone at the end of the season anyway. Jim Benning's tenure is incredibly interesting if you look at his cap-friendly page. Again, he has been the GM of this team for almost 7 years. And God help the Canucks if he sees 8. I mean, in 7 years, he's made 159 signings worth almost $600 million. He's made 46 trades, and are the Canucks any better for the vast majority of it? I would say no, especially when one of the highlights here was overpaying, you could argue, for Tanner Pearson to stick around. meaning that you have an incredibly interesting offseason coming up that everyone is well aware of, where Pettersson has to be re-signed, Quinn Hughes has to be re-signed. This team is a mess. I don't think it's an insurmountable task to get them back on track. Jim Benning is not the guy to do it. My thought is that the Aquilinis are keeping him around for the sake of what we're seeing in Columbus with John Tortorella, where it's easier to do this in the offseason. Granted, I don't think Jim Benning's contract is up with the team. I actually don't have that information in front of me. I'm surprised Cap Friendly doesn't necessarily have that information as far as how long he signed for. But the writing is on the wall for Jim Benning and the Vancouver Canucks. And if they don't, part ways here, then the Canucks organization unfortunately gets what they deserve. I mean, do they have the best pieces to part with? No. But even Ottawa got something for Eric Goodbranson. I know Sutter has a modified no trade, but there's something you could have gotten for Sutter. Alex Edler is 34 years old. I know he has a no movement. Maybe he said no, but and I don't know for sure, but you'd like to have at least seen Alex Edler get moved for something. I can't imagine. I mean, who knows? Maybe Alex Edler's a really strong family man. He says, I don't want to go from Canada down to a U.S. team with everything going on. I'm staying here because at least there's some sort of comfort and familiarity. Maybe that was the case. They had some pieces that they could potentially strip away here. They did nothing. They barely did anything in terms of getting, half decent assets, and you re-signed Tanner Pearson still for over $3 million a season. It's a fail for the Canucks. I don't see how it could be anything else.
I mean, looking over the last 6 years, he really only made two impactful moves. One was to acquire Tyler Toffoli, who was only there for 10 games. And then the only impactful move is when he acquired JT Miller. So it's like, to me, it's like a lot of shuffling without any results. And that's not what you want from your GM. You either want your GM to be objectively bad or objectively good. You can't just have, you can't stay neutral forever. I don't know. I think it's a real rough situation with the decision making over in Vancouver. So I think
too, the writing's on the wall, right?
Yeah.
For both GM and head coach. You could argue first, what is the issue with the Canucks this year? Was it the team the front office put together? Is it Travis Green not being a good enough coach? Bottom line is, I don't think either of those two individuals are long for this organization at this stage. Because again, you bring in a new GM, they're going to want to bring in their coach. They're going to want to bring in their guy, and Travis Green's probably on the outs. He'll find work very fast, I'm sure, as an assistant. But yeah, I think there are wholesale changes coming to the Vancouver Canucks sooner rather than later. I know that sucks to hear for Canucks fans, although I'm sure acceptance is there at this point. But it really does suck when you had that little bit of a magical playoff run this past summer, only to then have it turn into this. But I don't think any Canucks fan is necessarily surprised at this because, again, those bad contracts, you knew they were going to come home to roost eventually, and they did. You lose Markstrom, which, granted, I still think was the right move, but it's just been death by 1,000 cuts, and it's only going to get worse for Vancouver.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a front office problem. Like, they've got legitimate stars on this team. You got Pettersson, you got Brock Besser, you got JT Miller, you got Bo Horvat, you got Quinn Hughes, who obviously could learn the two-way game a little bit better. But even then, yeah, this team is mismanaged. You've got the stars to build around. You only need 4 stars to win a cup. And
I mean, you saying that though, right? Like they're not screwed.
No, they're not screwed at all.
This isn't a situation where you blow the whole thing up. No, if they get the right guy in place or woman, hey, why not? Go for it. Get the most qualified person no matter what. If you get the right person for this job, this team, I think, could be right back towards, I'm going to say, cup contention if everything goes well within a couple of seasons. I don't think this is a completely insurmountable situation for Vancouver.
No, yeah, I agree. Yeah, they're not screwed at all. They definitely need to bring in two guys who know what they're talking about, that can retool and put in the pieces to support the stars on this team, that's the issue, is the stars on this team don't have any support. It's verb tense. It's not important.
So we'll move on to Calgary then. Calgary making 2 deals over the last 2 days of the deadline. Of course, that first trade we already mentioned, sending one big save Dave to Toronto. 50% retained salary. They pick up a 3rd-round pick next year. And they send Sam Bennett and a 2022 6th-rounder to the Florida Panthers in exchange for prospect Emil Heineman and a 2022 2nd-rounder. So, Deej, obviously, there's going to be the temptation to talk about this from the Florida perspective. We'll get there. For Calgary, I think this was a winning deadline. I do. The 3rd-round pick for Big Save Dave. Why not? I mean, again, Riddick really wasn't long for this team with Markstrom being there. And then let's call a spade a spade. They maximized the return on Sam Bennett, picking up a 2nd-rounder and Emil Heineman, who was 43rd overall in the 2nd round this past October in the draft. Indeed, we talked about it on the live show yesterday. 13 points in 43 games in the SHL for Lexans as a 19-year-old, which is a pretty damn impressive number as well. So Calgary, with the deals they made, I think they knocked it out of the park. Obviously, this is a team that we talked about where, I mean, number one, you could question if Brad Treliving's the guy. It looks like he's going to be allowed to be the guy after bringing back Daryl Sutter. It hasn't worked. They're not going to make the playoffs, but it seems as though Calgary ownership is perfectly fine with Brad Treliving being the guy. And I think this is the offseason that we see some things happen, some of those bigger deals at this stage, whether it be a Goodrow, a Monahan, whoever else. I mean, obviously there are still some rough contracts on this team, like Backlund and Lucic, who just hit 1,000 games, I believe. So congrats to Luch there. You could argue that there were some moves to be made. I mean, if you could have gotten something for Derek Ryan, it wouldn't have been a massive deal. Same thing for like Josh Levo. It wouldn't have been a massive deal. But obviously I think, you are looking towards this offseason where the decision has to be made, like I said, on Goodrow, on Monahan, on Mark Giordano, who's only under contract through next season at 37 years old as of this date. So for me, it's still a winning deal for Calgary. I think they knocked it out of the park with the moves that they made. They have, 2 third-round picks this year, and then 2 seconds and 2 thirds next year. So they're already stocked up pretty well. And if you make the right moves this offseason, again, I don't think they're quite in Vancouver's situation with the star players, but in terms of the long term, I would say closer to rebuild than retooling. This team, it does have the road to get back on the right track. It's just a matter of what they do this offseason. But for now, talking about the deadline, I give them a passing grade.
Yeah, I mean, exclusively at the deadline, I got to say I give them a passing grade. Obviously, it's a little confusing, the Sam Bennett trade from a Flames perspective, with him requesting a trade earlier in the season. And then when they brought in Daryl Sutter, he rescinded his trade request. He was like, hey, I like it here. I like this system. And then boom, gone. So that's a little confusing. I like the Big Save Dave move a lot. And I think Treliving has been playing... Treliving, I don't know how to pronounce it. I'm not good with words. He's been playing a very, very conservative game since June 23rd, 2018, where he traded Dougie Hamilton, Adam Fox, and Michael Furland for Elias Lindholm and Noah Hannafin. At the time, it looked like a 50-50 trade. Now it looks like they got blown out of the water. He's been playing very conservative since then, and I based on just the deadline alone, I'll give them a pass, is what I'll say. But I think they're playing too conservative in general.
I mean, that's the thing, though, right? Like, if they don't make those major moves this offseason, I don't know how Flames fans are going to feel at that stage. We'll move on to Montreal, who had a very interesting deadline indeed, picking up some blue line additions here, acquiring John Merrill from Detroit for Hayden Verbeek and a 5th-round pick this year, as well as picking up Eric Gustafson from Philadelphia for a 7th-rounder next year. So immediately for me, for Montreal, it's a W. I do think, you look at what they gave up, a 5th, a 7th, and an AHL level guy. I like Hayden Verbeek, but you're talking about a 23-year-old who's a long shot at this stage. And you pick up a true defensive defenseman in John Merrill and a true offensive defenseman in Eric Gustafson, who Flyers fans were very happy to see go, even if it was for as little as it was. Apparently there was no love there in the city of brotherly love. Boom. For Montreal, though, there was the talk, I think, of some Habs fans saying more, but I don't really know what they would have done necessarily. They are pretty tight against the cap at this stage, so I think any of the big-time forwards that you would have wanted wouldn't have necessarily been there at this stage, but I get the thought of, can we get somebody to help soften the blow of Brendan Gallagher getting injured? But again, when you have a $10 million goalie and some of the other contracts that you have out there, money was always going to be a little bit tight at this stage. And the funny thing is, the Habs are still set up incredibly well. And honestly, I think for them, it was kind of the right time to say, hey, look, we're a playoff team. But, Montreal, for example, even if they were to make it out of the North Division, which, right now they're the 4th best team, are they going to be able to hang with a Colorado, a Vegas, a Tampa, Carolina, Florida, Washington? I don't think Montreal's in that upper echelon. So I think it was very smart for Marc Bergevin to be very conservative. Again, he got some good acquisitions for low picks. And if you look at the Habs this year, Deej, 1st rounder, 2 2nd rounders, 2 3rd rounders, and 3 4th rounders at this stage. So they are still set up very well for this upcoming draft. They're set up very well for the future. They do have some contracts that they have to work out. Like, what are they going to do with Tatar and Philip Deneau? We don't quite know at this stage. And then obviously some veterans like Eric Stahl, Corey Perry will be off the team. But I think it was smart. It was smart. Get some help now, but don't overspend for it. You're still set up for the future. Very similar to Minnesota. Don't gamble away your future at the first inclination that you have a chance to potentially win a playoff series.
Yeah, I agree. I think they've done quite well here. They're going to have some cap room to play with in the offseason. I think they might be able to compete for the Northern Division. We'll see what happens in the playoffs. This team has been built with some grit. And they've looked good since adding Eric Stahl. Even though he only has the one goal, he's obviously changed the way the forwards are structured and the lines, and they seem to be buzzing. So yeah, I think that's a really good point you make. At the very first sign of success, don't gamble your future away. And they seem to be doing that. And I think, if anything, on the whole, it just says how stacked the West Division seems compared to the North right now.
Yeah, so for Montreal, for me, passing grade for the moves that they made and showing that bit of restraint. But speaking of restraint, we get to the Edmonton Oilers, Deej, who only made one move, and Ken Holland made those remarks today. They acquired Dmitry Kulikov from the New Jersey Devils for a conditional 4th that becomes a 3rd if they win a playoff series. That is a 4th rounder for 2022, that being next year. And that was it. However, it's another team that is ridiculously up against the cap, according to Cap Friendly. So there wasn't really too much that they could afford to do, unfortunately. And,
yeah,
a lot of that, some of it is their own fault. They have James Neal, who's making almost $5 million on the taxi squad. That certainly doesn't help. And then you get into some of the other contracts. Chris Russell, I get, why they re-signed him, but still he's making $4 million this year. That doesn't help at all. I get that they're keeping him around for the sake of the expansion draft, and that's fine. it's a team that, you certainly weren't going to sell pieces off of, but I know that Oilers fans wanted a little bit more. The issue is they don't even necessarily have the assets to add right now. They are already without their second, third, and fifth round picks. Shout out to that motorcycle in the background if you could hear that. But they're already without 3 of their first picks in the first 5 rounds. 2 of them, I believe, from the Andreas Athanasiou trade. That second round pick from that particular deal as well. So it's a rough spot for the Oilers right now. Where does this team need a little bit more? Yeah, and especially Toronto ahead of them, as we'll get to. They added quite a bit. So it really feels like Edmonton got left behind here. But, I think Kulikov is a really good addition for that blue line. We talked about that a few weeks ago, where we rank the blue lines here. Kulikov as a stay-at-home defensive defenseman really helps out that blue line. But from there, your hands were kind of tied with some of the other moves that you had made in the past, and it really limited what they could do here, unfortunately.
Yeah. I agree. And, Ken Holland, he's the one that came out with the quote and said you can't go for it every year. So this is a win for Edmonton. They did what they could. They got a defenseman. They needed a defenseman. But, yeah, this team is going to be in a weird spot where they just need one more valuable player, but are going to be completely unable to afford it.
Yeah, so, I give it an indifferent kind of grade. I think they did okay, given the circumstances. I wouldn't call it an outright failure. And at the end of the day, it's still a dangerous team heading into the playoffs. And whether or not it's Winnipeg, which it looks like it very well could be, or somebody else, they're going to be a tough team to handle come playoff time. So an indifferent grade for me, but it was going to be pretty damn tough in general, I think, Deej, for them to knock it out of the park in these circumstances. And that will bring us to Winnipeg, where again, they didn't do much. We already talked about it, sending a 6th-round pick this year to Vancouver for Jordy Ben. I don't know if Jordy Ben is who you would have wanted to shore things up defensively, but again, it was another team with very little cap space. They do have, all of their picks for the first 3 rounds of the draft over the next 3 years, which is nice, including an extra 3rd rounder next year from the Jack Eichel trade. I wish the Jack Eichel trade out. The Jack Roslovic trade. Trying to manifest an Eichel trade here post-deadline. Who's to say? But, with Winnipeg again, not that much cap space to work with. There really was only so much you were going to be able to do. And I think it was one of those moves where you made that big-time trade earlier this season. You certainly weren't going to see another blockbuster now. You are 1 point ahead of Edmonton with an equal amount of games played. Neither team made those big additions. I'd say Edmonton made the bigger of the two. I'd certainly take Kulikov over Jordy Ben. That's not even a conversation. But, for Winnipeg, you lost Nathan Beaulieu to injury for the rest of the year, so you bring in another veteran presence on the blue line that can maybe compete with some of these other guys. I'd have it as indifferent because of the limitations that they were facing due to cap space. But obviously, you look at this team, and I don't know how many people are won over by looking at this roster and saying, yep, this is a team that can directly compete with some of the big-time teams, despite the fact they're going to be a playoff team. So I'm somewhere in the middle on this one.
Yeah. Obviously, they've got a formula. It's working. They don't really have any glaring weaknesses across the lineup. And I don't know. I feel like adding anything would have been a luxury, and they would have had to play some games with the current lineup in order to facilitate such a trade. So, they grab Jordy Ben, fits in, veteran presence on the blue line, like you said. And there's really, I don't know. I feel like this team didn't have any weaknesses, so it's a real if it ain't broke, don't fix it situation.
And with that, we will move on to the top team in the North Division, the most active team for this deadline day time frame, the Toronto Maple Leafs, who, Deej, I don't even need to say it, are a gigantic winner in this situation.
Yes.
They kicked things off with giving up a conditional 7th-round pick next year to Columbus for Riley Nash, who is currently injured, but is a phenomenal penalty killing option. That despite the Leafs having a good PK situation, the Leafs certainly needed more players like this, more than they needed that high firepower offensive addition like a Taylor Hall. And no, I'm not just saying that because, of course, Hall went to Boston. You look at how this team was built, and it was clear what Kyle Dubas thought they needed, as they also went out and acquired one Nick Foligno. And again, that was a first-round pick this year and a fourth-rounder next year to Columbus. San Jose also gets a fourth-round pick this year from Toronto for retaining salary, and the Leafs acquired Nick Foligno and Stefan Nason. So with Foligno, again, this is one of those big deals involving three people who, that trade exists for the sole, or involving three teams that exists for the sole purpose of the double retention that Deej, you mentioned this on the live show, and I think it's something we need to keep an eye on. I could see this being barred from, being legal at this stage, because I'm sure some GMs will complain, because Nick Foligno goes from a $5.5 million cap hit to costing Toronto at this stage a lowly $1.375 million, from 5.5 to 1.375 because of the double retention. It's a very shrewd move by Kyle Dubas. I'm not complaining about it as a Bruins fan. Round of applause for Kyle Dubas going full NHL 21 franchise mode on that one. And for Toronto, I know a lot of Leafs fans are complaining about this, but I don't think those are the very smart ones. That's right. I said it. I think Nick Foligno is a phenomenal addition. Again, I'm very much entrenched in the analytics side of things, but there's no denying in terms of the locker room presence, the leadership, the grit, the penalty killing that Foligno brings to this team. You guys talked all offseason about, my God, yes, Wayne Simmons and how awesome it is to have the Scarborough boy playing for this team. Nick Foligno's dad played for this team, and he will be wearing the same number his father did, if I'm not mistaken. You want to talk about that idea of, my God, it's like someone was just meant to wear this jersey. Nick Foligno is that guy. I love this trade for them. We talked about the Dave Riddick pickup for a third next year. Love that. The Ben Hutton addition for a fifth next year. Love that as a depth option. And then sending off Barabanov for Suomela is just kind of, just one of those, why not kind of moves. Toronto knocked it out of the park here for the cap limitations that they have, addressing what they needed to, the changes that they needed to make. And I get the idea of, get Taylor Hall to bump Zach Hyman down to the third line. I get that, I guess. But, Kyle Dubas talked about it. The emergence of Alex Galchenyuk and what he's been able to do on the Leafs changed their plans in terms of the idea of what they need to go out and get. Now, whether or not you believe in Galchenyuk or not at this stage, it's up to you. He has 6 points in 12 games as a Leaf this season. But, I think there are those Leafs fans who 1 second were all aboard the Galchenyuk hype train, and the second they don't go out and trade for Taylor Hall, it's, he's not good enough now. So I've said this a lot. You can't have your cake and eat it too. Welcome to being a contender where you don't get the best of both worlds. Sometimes you got to give a little to get a little. And you wanted this team. You wanted Kyle Dubas to make this team a cup contender. Welcome to being a cup contender. And it's called looking at your cap friendly and showing, oh my God, we don't have our first, third, or fourth this year. We don't have our third, fourth, or fifth next year. Welcome to being a contender. Are they completely leveraging away their future? No, because as Leafs fans love to point out, they had 1,000 picks last year, did they not? And they still have some picks to work with now. And this as well is what happens when you want to keep, three $11 million players on your team with Matthews, Tavares, and Marner. This is what happens. You want all of those guys on your team. Cool. You have to make those sacrifices. I think Kyle Dubas is doing a phenomenal job. If we were to name one winner right now, outright, who did the best during this deadline period, that trophy goes to Toronto. Does that trophy mean anything? No, it's not the trophy that you want, But in terms of getting your team and pushing them to that next level to directly on paper compete with the likes of Tampa and Colorado, Toronto is right there if they weren't already. Home run for Kyle Dubas and the Toronto Maple Leafs.
Yeah, if I'm Kyle Dubas, I see this team that has struggled to get out of the first round for so many years now with all the talent it has. And I do anything I can to push them over the edge. And that's exactly what Kyle Dubas just did. So, I mean, this team's ready to compete. This team looks like a cup contender right now.
And I mean, you look at it too, and again, we talked about the cap limitations, but that forward core, if that forward core isn't good enough, I don't know what forward core is. Defensively, they get those defensive additions, and we talked about it, the additions of, Brody and Muzzin over the last 2 years, what Justin Hall has been able to do. And then goaltending-wise now too, I mean, Freddie Anderson being on LTIR is what allowed this to happen, but heading into the playoffs, you have your options of Anderson, Campbell, Riddick, even Hutchinson. There aren't too many teams, Colorado's similar, that have the liberty of having 4 guys that you could say, okay, well, maybe we're not completely screwed if you were to start them in a playoff series. And I know that's still very weird to say about Michael Hutchinson because of the experiences in prior seasons. But as Leafs fans know, he has a .919 in 8 games this season. So there isn't too much more else to add about this for this with me. I mean, this is a home run for Toronto and Kyle Dubas.
Yeah, without a doubt.
So with that, then, shall we move to the Central?
We shall.
All right.
Central Division.
Yeah. Let's start at the top this time. Why not? And we will talk about the lovely Tampa Bay Lightning. Now, for Tampa this time out, obviously, I don't think too many people were expecting major moves because of cap limitations, and then they went off and pulled off a major move anyway because the rich get richer. My God. Obviously, we already talked about Magnus Krona for Freddie Claesson, which, what'd you say?
Big time.
Big time. Freddie Claesson as a depth defensive option. Big time, Magnus Krona. The big addition here, though, no disrespect to Freddie Claesson, is big time Magnus Krona. It was another 3-team trade that we've talked about. And again, good on Columbus for getting involved with this. We'll talk about them in a bit. But a first this year from Tampa and a third next year from Tampa. The Lightning also send a 4th-round pick to Detroit this year in exchange for David Savard and Brian Lashoff. So David Savard goes from a $425 million cap hit down to, I believe, just over $1 million on the Lightning because I love this. Like I said, I'm with you, Deech. This is going to get nerfed. Like, there's no way that certain GMs will allow this to happen again. But you talk about a team, defending champions. Deej, over the next 2 years, they have 1 first, 1 third, and 1 fourth over the next 2 years. But that's fine because they're going for it. And you talk about expiring contracts on this team. It's just Coleman, Goodrow, Savard, Shen, and Curtis McElhinney. They're still set up to be contenders over the next 2 years. Julien Brisebois grabbing the baton from Steve Yzerman and running with it. This team is a well-oiled machine, not just for this year, but for next. And you talk about it, the big offensive addition, they didn't need to make one. They're getting Kucherov back for the playoffs. They add David Savard, a premier defensive defenseman in this league. You look at that defense core as it stands right now on Cap Friendly with Hedman, McDonough, Sergachev, Chernak, Savard, and Luke Shen. One of those things is not like the other, but this is a phenomenal team. It's an A+ for the Tampa Bay Lightning. You didn't have much room to make a move. You made a phenomenal move in Savard. Absolute win for the Tampa Bay Lightning.
Yeah, I've got to agree. I'm looking forward to the offseason to see how they continue wiggling around cap room and seeing how they handle the long-term injured reserve situation. It's just so much salary on the books here. It's crazy. They lawyered out the rules. They did a great job. They found a way. That's what Tampa finds a way. They always do. They found a way this year. This team's scary. This team, I am not excited to be one of Nashville or Chicago because at this point, I would be shocked if Carolina won the Central over Tampa right now.
So as it stands, they are on identical games played and identical points with 41 games, 58 points. Tampa above them right now on tiebreaker. And we'll transition then to talking about Carolina because Tampa are the Cup favorites until they're not. Let's be honest. As good as Toronto looks, or Colorado or Vegas or anyone else as defending champions that still look this strong, Tampa is still the favorites. We talked about this a little bit with Carolina yesterday. Aside from dealing Hayden Fleury, they pick up a 6th-round pick next year and Yanni Hakanpää, who is a true defensive defenseman that is probably more of a depth option for them. Carolina stood where they were despite about $9 million in listed cap space on Cap Friendly. I give it an L for Carolina. They are losers of this deadline because of what Tampa was able to do and because of what Florida was able to do underneath them as well. And you mentioned this yesterday. It really does seem like this year was a year to go for it for Carolina because of the upcoming changes to that roster. And this is a team that has all of their picks over the next 3 years, with the exception of missing a 5th rounder this year, and they have extra picks in the later rounds of the next 2 drafts. They have 3 7th rounders this year. They have all of their draft picks, nearly $9 million in cap space. They did nothing. And I don't know if that's the right move to make, because as you've mentioned, Deej, at the end of this season, Andrei Svechnikov needs to be re-signed. He's an RFA. Dougie Hamilton is a UFA. Jake Bean is an RFA. At this rate, he's going to cost $1 million or $2 million with 11 points in 31 games as a rookie. You have all 3 of your goaltenders on expiring deals. UFAs for Reimer and Mrazek. Nedeljkovic is an RFA. And Teuvo Teravainen's on IR. If he comes back, great, but it's looking like he might not. This is a team in a very bad spot. Now, you do have as well an extra $2.25 or about $2.33 million coming off the books this year as well, as it's the final year of the Alex Semin buyout. So you have $10 million heading into next year, knowing that you should be able to work it out to re-sign Hamilton and Svechnikov, most likely. Maybe there's a different sacrifice there to try and fit everybody in. I don't understand the lack of rentals. I don't. I just, it has to be a loss.
Yeah, I don't either.
And whether or not it's players that went elsewhere or players that were still out there. I mean, we mentioned the likes of Dustin Brown and Alex Edler, even though you maybe didn't need the defensive help, but there were players to go out. Ricard Raquel, if there was a team that could risk it on Ricard Raquel, despite some injury concerns and some production issues, it was Carolina. It's a loss for the Hurricanes. I have no other way to phrase it.
Yeah. I've got to agree. Like, I don't understand why they didn't. They look great. Like, they're one piece away from being like a certified cup contender. They've got $8 million in trade deadline cap space, all their picks. I feel like I'm missing something. That's how baffling this is to me.
I mean, I get that to some staunch Hurricanes defenders, this could come off as a couple of schmucks criticizing one of the best GMs in the NHL, and Don Waddell. And I am not denying how fantastic of a GM Don Waddell happens to be, because he is phenomenal. But I don't think you have to be an expert in the field to be able to say that this was a very puzzling lack of movement from Carolina, and they might be the biggest losers of this window here for trade deadline this time out.
Yeah, I agree.
So with that said, we'll move on to unless you got something else.
No, I'm ready to talk about the Panthers, because this is an interesting deadline for them.
Yes, it was. And I do want to certainly get your opinion on all of this. So we'll look back first to April 2nd. Of course, the minor trade sending Vinny Hinostroza back to Chicago for Brad Morrison in a bit of a cap dump. They then, on April 8th, sent Brett Connolly, Henrik Borgstrom, Riley Stillman, and a 7th this year to Chicago for Lucas Wallmark and Lucas Carlson, what appeared to be another cap dump at this stage. And again, giving up Borgstrom and Stillman, we'll see how that works out. Brett Connolly scored, I think, in his Hawks debut. But they make these moves, from the looks of it, Deej, in order to make these ones, as they send a 2021 third rounder, so a third round pick this year, to Buffalo for Brandon Montour. And they also, of course, sent what was essentially 2 second round picks to Calgary in exchange for Sam Bennett and a 6th rounder next year. So you look at these deals, and again, it's the latter two that we're really focusing on here as impactful trades. We all knew that they kind of needed to make a blue line move after the loss of Aaron Ekblad. They do that with Montour, and as you labeled it, on deadline day, the great fog of Buffalo, you are banking on Montour being better than what he's appeared to be because of how bad that Sabres team is. And with Sam Bennett, you're hoping that he can kind of capture something. And Bennett said it himself. It never really seemed like a fit in Calgary. And you talk about the complete change of going to a Coach Quenneville coach team. And you mentioned with Sam Bennett, kind of the excitement of like, hey, Daryl Sutter's here. I mean, Daryl Sutter and Coach Quenneville, cut from the same cloth, I would say. There is the feeling to me that, yes, was it perhaps an overpayment for Sam Bennett? Yes. But I do feel like, and maybe it's just, me trying to give Florida the benefit of the doubt because they're your team, but I genuinely believe that Sam Bennett could thrive in Florida. It's a win for the Panthers. They had more money to spend, so you could argue maybe there was a better
they had an additional $9 million.
Yeah, so maybe
in trade deadline cap space because of the Aaron Ekblad injury.
Yeah, so maybe there was another short-term deal or two they could have made involving some money, again, up front, whether it had been a veteran like Dustin Brown, kind of the usual suspects that you would throw out there, that they could have made those moves because they do have, their first-round pick over the next 2 years, and maybe they could have done a little bit more. If it's not an outright win, though, it's trending towards being a win. I'm stuck between those two, knowing how much cap space they had. But, I also understand for the Cats why it might not have been, the perfect idea to say, let's go for it. And perhaps that Ekblad injury really did kind of throw them a little bit to say, let's pump the brakes a little bit and not totally leverage the future.
Yeah. So there's a few things I want to mention here. So I think the Brett Connolly trade to Chicago really, in my opinion, had nothing to do with this team's playoff chances this year or the trade deadline. To me, that's just them getting Brett Connolly off the books. Riley Stillman wasn't working out here defensively. Henrik Borgstrom was struggling. And he's looked significantly worse than Anton Lundell. They're playing for the same Liga club. Lucas Wallmark's an interesting reacquisition because Coach Q didn't really use him a lot when he was here last year. So this was them shedding cap. After next year, they need to re-sign Alexander Barkov. So if you have an opportunity to get rid of Connolly, who's like a guy that's just not producing for us, but is clearly still talented, but just isn't fitting the system, you get rid of him. Brandon Montour, no idea. Couldn't tell you if he's the Brandon Montour of the Ducks or the Brandon Montour of the Sabres. I know which one I'm hoping for. Either way, you can't replace Aaron Ekblad. This is just a guy that can kind of do a little bit of what Ekblad did, but nowhere near as good. But obviously, we don't really have that in our lineup with Ekblad gone. So I like that move a lot. There's another move here that I count as a deadline move, even though it wasn't really a trade. That's the signing of one Nikita Gusev, who was not working out with the Devils. As many Devils fans will tell you, he was just too slow of a skater to play with the Devils. The Panthers are a slow, methodical puck possession team. They're not really a rush team. So I can't wait to see how Gusev plays with us.
So the reason why I can't label it an outright W for Florida is because I was going to bring up that Gusev trade, or the Gusev signing, I should say. And you combine Montour, Bennett, Gusev. What is the common theme here for Florida? Wild card.
Unknowns.
It's the unknown. So I can't label it an outright win because there is just too much that is unknown about how this is going to work out. With hindsight, we'll know for a fact. So I can't, it's certainly not towards lost territory. I'm somewhere in between a win and indifferent because there's just too much of an unknown element to their moves where honestly I could see it working out in a big time way, but we just don't know. But it's certainly not a loss for Florida.
Yeah, I mean, I have them as indifferent on my list. It's not even an indifferent, it's an unknown is what I have them as. It's a huge question mark. There's a lot of risk and a lot of guys, but they didn't really give up a lot for these guys. So if these guys don't work out, it's not like the team lost anything.
I mean, Calgary fans are certainly happy with the seconds, but I get your point in that, well, you didn't leverage a first, right? Or any of your top tier prospects. You didn't lose anything on the team this year. You know what I mean? Like the team's still intact for this run. But there is something I want to address on the Bennett trade. I still feel like it was expensive. I don't know which Sam Bennett we're going to get, but a lot of people in Florida Panthers fan groups, yes, they do exist. They were going on about, well, like we paid more for Bennett than Taylor Hall. And so it's interesting to me that Sam Bennett is an RFA after this year, where we have acquired his RFA rights, which I think is kind of why this was a little bit more expensive. Yes. So to just add to that and to completely cut you off like a jerk, in terms of, you paid more for Bennett than Taylor Hall, the RFA thing is a factor. Hall being a UFA is a factor. And it's come out that Taylor Hall essentially handpicked the Boston Bruins and handcuffed the Buffalo Sabres, which was always a factor. And we'll talk about that more, that Taylor Hall, when he signed in Buffalo, had that control of that no movement clause or no trade to be able to basically say, well, if this doesn't work out and we suck, I at least get to have a lot of say in choosing where I go. So I don't think it's fair. And I've talked about that. You can't compare the Bennett return to Foligno. You can't directly compare Taylor Hall to Foligno or Bennett. Totally different circumstances involving different teams and different situations. It's not NHL 21 where it's just like, oh, well, this was a first instead of a second, or this was a third instead of 2 seconds. You lost. It's not that simple.
Yeah, I agree. So I feel like we can revisit this in 2 weeks and see how the Panthers did.
Agreed. So with that, then we'll move on to the Nashville Predators. And God, Deej, you want to talk about a team stuck in purgatory right now? Currently in a playoff spot, the 4th seed in the Central, 2 points clear of the Chicago Blackhawks, 6 points ahead of the Dallas Stars, who do have 3 games at hand. Nashville, one trade, acquiring Eric Goodbranson from Ottawa for Brandon Fortunato in that 7th round pick. So they get Eric Goodbranson for nothing. You're in purgatory. You are in purgatory if you are a Preds fan, where something's got to give with David Poile. And I get that David Poile has been there since the beginning. 23 years, nearly 24 in June, that David Poile has been at the helm of the Nashville Predators. However, while on the plus side, this team has essentially all of their draft picks, minus later round picks over the next 3 years, which is huge. You shot yourself in the foot. Because 2 to 3 weeks ago, you're in sell now mode. Oh my God, Ekholm's going to go. And then you start winning. And you had a great month. You've won 8 of your last 10 still as of this day. And then you didn't sell. But nor did you buy. You are just what you are. And at this stage, if you make the playoffs, you seem like fodder for whatever one of the 3 teams above you wins that top division crown. Again, they're in that spot, and I'm sure Rangers fans are happy about this because you are now the standard bearer for this. They're in that New York Rangers spot of, well, we could make it, but if we do, we're going to suck. So let's just say, to hell with this and retool. Obviously, for Nashville, you're in a bit of a cap crunch with some teams, or how the hell do you retool? But you could have sold Granlund. You didn't need to bring on Goodbranson. You maybe could have worked out that Ekholm trade. And if you didn't this year, you're probably going to have to next year because he's on an expiring deal. I mean, you're also destroyed by injuries right now with Duchesne and Philip Forsberg on IR. It's a loss for me with Nashville because you are what you are, which is a fringe playoff team. Like, are you telling me this team's going to turn it on and make it out of the Central over Tampa, Carolina, or Florida? I'm not a betting man. I'm willing to bet that they don't. I don't see how you could, if you're Nashville, how staying with the status quo was the way to go. This is a loss.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. There's no obvious direction for this team to go in. Also, I think that's a real problem. I don't know. This is, for the most part, this is the same core that went to the Stanley Cup Finals, and they're not really putting up numbers anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see how you keep those draft picks to say, oh, well, we're not leveraging our future. Like, this core is still your future? This core, all you need to do is bring in the recruitments over the next couple of years to the draft and through free agency and whatever else. This core with the additions is what's going to get you over the edge. I just don't see it. There's no way.
I don't either. I'm very confused. Like, are you hoping UC Saros drags you to a cup final? Like, is that what they want? I don't know. When I look at this team and I'm like, okay, let's say Florida miraculously wins this division, faces Nashville in the first round. The only chance they have is if UC Saros plays out of his mind. The only chance they have against Carolina is if UC Saros plays out of his mind. The only chance they have against Tampa is if UC Saros plays out of his mind and then some. I don't know. And I think as we look at Nashville doing that, I think that Stan Bowman of Chicago saw the exact same thing I just saw, where there are three teams that will blow you out of the water. So let's not go for it this year. And that's like, whenever Patrick Kane's contract's up in 2023, like, you're not going to pay him more than he's already making. It's not like there's a window there. Your stars are your stars. They're still putting up. You got to retool the rest of the lineup. And so they acquired a whole bunch of picks and players that may or may not fit the Chicago Blackhawks system, because Stan Bowman understands that it takes a very specific type of player to fit into this system. So you kind of got to throw shit at the wall. Not to say these players are shit in any way, but you kind of you got to roll dice on players here for the Chicago Blackhawks. You got to try whoever you can to plug in. And I think this is a huge win for the Blackhawks.
Yeah, so Chicago made 6 trades dating back to the beginning of this month. Of course, we talked about Hinostroza, as well as the Connolly deal from Florida. Also mentioned, of course, picking up Adam Gaudette, as well as sending Carl Soderberg to Colorado for 2, I'm going to call them minor leaguers for now. Of course, as well, getting involved in directly involved in the Janmark trade, where they end up with a 2nd-round pick this year and a 3rd-round pick next year, both from Vegas, as well as, of course, picking up a 4th-round pick in exchange for Madison Bowie and a 5th-round pick. So Chicago did very well, as to where now you end up with 2 2nd-round picks this year, as well as 2 4ths. They don't have their 3rd, but they have 2 3rd-round picks next year as well. They have, of course, all of their 1st and 2nds over the next 3 years. And they stripped away some pieces to this team that they needed to make because of very limited cap space. But like you said, they did a very Chicago thing of, hey, let's just get some guys. Let's see if they're fits. And if they're not, well, hey, we didn't give up much. If anything, we gained in acquiring them in the first place. It's a win for Chicago and Stan Bowman. Not a major win. It's not as if they were in that same situation as Tampa, where it's a win because you got even better to improve your already existing incredibly high cup odds. But it's a win, like you said, because they're like, okay, like you said, they're in that position. Stan Bowman had the realization of, well, this is where we are. Let's not pretend that we're not. And I guess you could argue that maybe Nashville's core is in a better spot than Chicago's. I don't know about that. I mean, maybe because of the defense core, but then we could get into talking about, well, hey, Ryan Johansson and Matt Duchesne are your core in Nashville for forwards compared to Patrick Kane and Alex DeBrincat. It's a win for Chicago. At the very least, it's trending towards indifferent. But if I'm a Hawks fan, I'm pretty happy with how this deadline day happened to go.
Yeah, I agree. They did what Chicago needs to do, and that's find value players that can play with their stars. Fill out the bottom six. It looks great. This is a huge win for them. Now, there's another team here in the Central that I'm a little... I don't know how to even grade this trade deadline because they didn't do anything. And obviously with Ben Bishop and Tyler Seguin hurt, I understand not going for it this year. That said, if there is one of these bottom five teams in the Central that I think can hang with the top three, it's Dallas.
And I mean, that's a fair thought because obviously they made the Cup final last year. I will say that this is a team that hasn't made a trade since February 24th of 2020. But, it's really tough because you look at this team, right? No cap space. They have every single one of their draft picks over the next 3 years with no bonuses. So just nothing. Well, they have Rick bonus, but no bonuses with any of the extra draft picks. They just have their 1 through 7 for each of the next 3 years. No cap space is mentioned. You could make the argument of maybe trying to strip away some pieces, but let's be honest, you're not getting much for anybody on a UFA type of deal. Andrew Cogliano, Blake Como, Jamie Alexiak's name was thrown out. He probably would have fetched you the most. They pick up Sammy Vatanen on waivers, which is their one addition, which I don't know, man. All indications are that Sammy Vatanen's well and done at this point. But like you mentioned at this stage, you've been without Ben Bishop for the entirety of the season. Right now, Alex Radulov is on IR. Tyler Seguin is working his way back and might play this season is the most recent word. Is getting Tyler Seguin back enough to jump Chicago and Nashville? Time will tell. It could very well be. I mean, I'm indifferent on Dallas. With the lack of cap space, you certainly weren't going to be buyers. You could have been sellers, but I understand the idea of saying, hey, let's just keep this team together. If we get happy and healthy, we can make the playoffs and maybe go on a run. We did it last year. So I see the argument for them more so than Nashville to stand pat as opposed to, not selling. There is certainly the argument that I can see from Stars fans, though, if you said, hey, I would have at least liked a couple of extra fourth or fifths and maybe a second or a third for Alexiak, depending on the price. But I'm going to go with indifferent for Dallas. I think it's more justifiable that they stayed where they were.
Yeah, I agree. So we'll go to one of the big sellers here in Columbus.
Yes.
I want to give them a passing grade. I feel like they could have done better. If this was a letter system, I'd probably give them a C+ to B-. So I don't know. I sit in the middle. Give me your thoughts.
All right. So again, to recap what Columbus did, they picked up the conditional 7th next year for Riley Nash, as well as picking up a 1st this year from Tampa and a 3rd from Tampa next year, as well as a 1st this year from Toronto and a 4th from Toronto next year. So the Columbus Blue Jackets obviously not going to be buyers, pretty much out of the playoffs, barring a miracle. They had cap space to make moves if they were in a more winning situation. They're not. So what do? They sell and now sit with 3 first-round picks this year, which is phenomenal. And I'm trying not to let what's been a bad season cloud my judgment, or knowing that impending changes are coming, knowing that there's no chance in hell that John Tortorella comes back next year. Obviously, though, for Columbus, it's frustrating because you would have had hopes of being a playoff team this year, flat out. Like, yes, on paper, the Central could have been rather competitive. It's been a very disappointing year. It's tough to say that picking up 2 first-round picks in this market is a fail, and I don't think it is. Could you have sold a little bit more? I mean, aside from maybe moving one of your 2 goalies, but I don't necessarily think that you had to. I don't really know who else that you would have moved off this roster, in fairness, simply because there's just a lot of undesirables, I'd call them. How much is Mikhail Grigorenko going to fetch you? You pretty much got rid of the guys I think that you could get rid of with Savard and with Foligno. And the good thing is, obviously, they're only being retained for this year, so that opens up more cap. Shout out to the Scott Hartnell buyout that's ending this year, so that's more cap being freed up next year, too. So heading into the offseason, they're going to have a lot of cap to play with. They have the draft stock to play with. I think the deadline was a win, but obviously the feeling around the Columbus organization as a whole is just, ugh. The John Tortorella situation.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
Is Patrick Laine going to want to come back? I don't know. Like, I can't imagine it. I can't imagine it unless he's like heavily involved in picking the coach. It's just, I know he's an RFA and technically, in theory, the control is out of his hands. But Columbus right now is staring at the precipice of a very bad time. Because who you name as coach next is very important.
Yes.
What happens with Patrick Laine is very important. How you manage these draft picks coming up are very important. It's a win for the deadline, but man, you talk about the teams we've discussed so far in terms of that feeling of, God, what the hell's next for you? More so than a St. Louis if they decide to tear it down. More so, more so than a San Jose or a Calgary. Columbus is that team that I look at where it's like, man, it sucks that you were where you were just, a year or two ago to where you are now. I mean, you're looking at a team that could potentially be a bottom feeder here as soon as next year, depending on what happens. And that's kind of crazy to say, but I think that's where they're at. So again, to reiterate for the third time, a win for the deadline, but just I think depressed is the word for it if I was a Blue Jackets fan moving forward.
Yeah, I've got to agree.
So lead us to then, buddy. Talk about interesting teams to discuss.
I would say amongst all the teams, there are three big winners. Two of them were buyers, and one is the seller of sellers, and that is the Detroit Red Wings. Won huge yesterday, and the days preceding it. They made out like bandits.
So I labeled Toronto my big winner. Maybe you're right that we should have clarified like big winners in terms of buyers, big winners in terms of sellers, because it is tough to say that the Detroit Red Wings did not win this deadline period. As we look back on April 9th, again, a fourth-round pick next year for Patrick Nemeth. Solid deal. From an analytical standpoint, of course, Nemeth has more value. They then pick up a free fourth-round pick in this year from Tampa in exchange for retaining cap on David Savard. They get a fifth-round pick this year in Hayden Verbeek for John Merrill. But it's that if you take all of those into account, and you're like, okay, is it really that special? The shot heard round the world as the deadline expired, trading Anthony Mantha to the Washington Capitals in exchange for Jakub Vrana, Richard Panik, a first-rounder this year, and a second-rounder next year, setting up Detroit with an incredible situation. I mean, number one, you're talking about a team that's listed current cap space today at $33 million. In terms of draft picks, 2 firsts this year, 3 seconds, 2 thirds, 2 fourths, 2 fifths. Next year, 2 seconds and 3 fourths. Steve Yzerman, I labeled him a wizard on Twitter. Yeah. And the funny thing is, he could have done more. He could have. Whether it be a Darren Helm, a Valtteri Filppula, a Luke Glendening, Sam Gagner. Mark Stahl's name was thrown around a lot. They had, I believe it's 3 retentions max, like it is in NHL, the video game that is. So they had room to retain on one more dude. There could have been one more move. And of course, Jonathan Bernier's name was thrown out there a lot as well. They could have made one more move, but also you have to think of it from a realistic standpoint of who the hell is going to play on this team. So in a way, maybe you do keep some of the veteran guys around that you could have flipped. It's obviously a win, though, for the one move alone where, unbeknownst to me, I hadn't really heard, but Jakub Vrana being a little bit unsettled in Washington, he's an RFA compared to an extra couple of years on the deal of Anthony Mantha. You look at this, though. I mean, Verana's going to have an amazing chance at 25 years old now to be a big piece of this team moving forward. He's 25. Dylan Larkin, 24. Of course, Zadina's only 21. And then you factor in the extra draft picks that they're going to be able to do damage with. Detroit is absolutely a winner at this stage. The only takeaway, I guess you could say, is, one more trade could have happened. But no, I mean, that Mantha deal, to get Vrana, they're both phenomenal players, Vrana and Mantha, but to also walk away with a first-round pick out of it, that way Washington has the security of knowing that Mantha's under contract where Vrana wasn't, and they don't have to go through a difficult negotiating period. It's a massive win for the Red Wings.
Yeah. They just have so many picks. Let's hope this is, it's Yzerman. He's going to find the players. This is a massive win for them.
You look back to Moritz Seider, and obviously the fan reactions when he was drafted, because people are like, what the hell? And Moritz Seider, even at his young age, you could argue, was the best defenseman in Sweden this year. So it's... again, we always joke, the Yzer plan, trust in Steve Yzerman. And for good reason. The Detroit Red Wings are in phenomenal hands. And I've said it all season long to Red Wings fans, enjoy the ride, because barring unforeseen circumstances, you see what's going on in Tampa right now, that could very well be in your future. All right, Deej, so with that, let's move on to the other side of this trade. We'll move to the Mass Mutual East Division. Remember when people cared about what these divisions were sponsored by or who they were sponsored by? We move on to the Washington Capitals, who are at the top of the East as it stands, dead even with points and games played as the Islanders, but they have them on tiebreaker. And for the Caps, it was quiet until it wasn't, is pretty much how to label it. It started off by trading Jonas Siegenthaler to the New Jersey Devils for a conditional third-round pick. It's a third-rounder no matter what, which I think is a great trade because it's someone who was in their lineup who wasn't playing at all this year. So a third-rounder for him is fantastic. Then you move into the Anthony Mantha trade, where, again, we just kind of recapped why Washington wanted Mantha. I still think it's a really good trade, even if you gave up a lot. And you also got Michael Raffl for a fifth-round pick this year from Philadelphia. It's a team with very little cap space. It's also a team now without their first and third this year and without their second next year. Deej, in terms of buying, I think they did well. I mean, their defense is still, I think, tremendous, especially, too, Zdeno Chara doing as well as he's done. The only big question, I think, aside from, is it going to pay off to end up with Anthony Mantha instead, is the goaltending. And we've talked about that. Is Ilya Samsonov and Vitek Vanacek, 24 and 25 years old, respectively, are these the guys to carry you into the playoffs? But we had made those comparisons with Jordan Binnington, with the likes of Matt Murray. Banking on young goaltenders isn't the worst thing to do. So all in all, I know the Caps gave up a lot. I still consider it a W for them in terms of the trade deadline overall. But you can't sit there and say they didn't give up a lot. So it's a W for me. I'd be very happy and content with their roster, to say the least. But you can't avoid the elephant in the room in that they gave up a lot in the Mantha deal.
Yeah. They gave up a lot in the deal. I think you nailed it on the head with the goalie questions. Will these guys be able to perform on the big stage? Because you do know that your stars can perform on the big stage. And a lot of them are getting older, but they still haven't hit a wall in their playing. When you're paying guys like Nick Backstrom and TJ Oshie almost into their 40s with these long contracts, the next 2-3 years, that's your window. Go for it. And so, the Capitals, they paid to add, but I got to say they won. This is a win for them. They made the right moves at the right time.
So with that, we'll move on to their direct competition in the form of the New York Islanders, who, I mean, DH outright, I'm going to label it a W before we even get into the moves. Of course, acquiring Kyle Palmieri and Travis Zajac from the New Jersey Devils in exchange for AJ Greer, Mason Jobs, a first-round pick this year, and a conditional fourth-round pick that could become a third if the Islanders advance to the Stanley Cup final this year. And of course, they also picked up Braden Coburn as a veteran depth defense option in exchange for a seventh-round pick next year from Ottawa. We talked about it. You need to try and offset the loss of Anders Lee, and I think they did just that with the very little cap space that they had to work with. You know, they don't have their own first or second this year. They do have Colorado's second, though, to kind of, you know, offset the damage taken there, to mitigate that a little bit. So all in all, talk about a team that needed to make a move to try and stay competitive with the best of their division, and I think the Islanders did just that with the Zajac and Palmieri pickups.
Yeah, I agree. Especially given what you said earlier with how it now looks that Taylor Hall basically would only accept a trade to Boston. I think you did what you could for the Islanders. Obviously, to me, them being down Anders Lee isn't necessarily as bad as the Panthers being down Aaron Ekblad, but it's very similar in that one of your very best irreplaceable players is who you're looking to find a fit for at the deadline. And I think they got close. I think they got very close with Zajac and Palmieri. I mean, obviously neither of those guys are Anders Lee, but you added to your forward depth and you gave yourself in Kyle Palmieri a guy who can, you know, he is known in his day to collect some garbage, which is kind of what you want.
I mean, yeah, it kind of fits the theme, right? And Lou Lamoriello continuing to bring former Devils to Long Island, so it works out quite well. We'll move on to the team that is currently in third place, and I can't believe this much of a gap has developed. I mean, we could talk about the East Division, and I'm sure we will later this week, because you have the Caps, Islanders, and Penguins all on 42 points. The top two on 58 points, or all on 42 games played, excuse me. The Caps and Islanders on 58 points, Pittsburgh on 56. The Penguins are right there, and there has been a gap developed between the top three and then the fourth seed Bruins and who's directly below them. But for the Pittsburgh Penguins, only one move made, of course, Jeff Carter, like we talked about, for a conditional third and fourth over the next 3 years. Deej, another team that didn't have a ton of cap space to work with. Another team that's already exhausted a lot of draft pick options. They have just their second and fifth this year, as well as their seventh and two extra sevenths now. So a team that's definitely going for it, which again, it's the right thing to do with a roster like this. You only get Crosby and Malkin for so long, Letang as well. Interesting, of course, that it went from, hey, we might trade Letang. Oh, hey, we might not be that good. Oh, actually, we're competing for the top spot in the division. So the Pittsburgh Penguins continuing to do Penguins things. I don't know how I feel about the Jeff Carter edition, though. Out of all the options that they could have brought in, it's a 36-year-old who is past his prime, to say the least. You know, the goaltending, again, unproven for the most part at the NHL level, but relatively solid. The defense, I don't think you could have made a move without, a subtraction from the already existing core. So, yeah, you look at the forwards to say, let's bring in some depth, or let's bring in an addition in general. Jeff Carter being the guy, though, can you sway me from an indifferent to a win or somewhere in between?
I can't, because the reasons I like this trade are purely emotional, and they're based on that I feel very good about this trade. I think it's going to work out in their favor. I mean, what's interesting to me is Ron Hextall. It's the GM of the Pittsburgh Penguins. He has previously been the GM of the, was he the GM of the Flyers, or was he just like their head? He had like a weird title, didn't he? Like director of personnel or something?
So Hextall was the GM of the Flyers, yeah, from 2014 to 2018. 4.5 years.
And then he was the assistant GM of the LA Kings. So, I mean, obviously Ron Hextall knows Jeff Carter, and he's watching this Penguins roster every night. And I don't think this was like, hey, there's a list of guys we could go get. I think Ron Hextall was like, this team needs Jeff Carter. I've watched Jeff Carter play almost every game from a booth and made a bunch of decisions about him. And I know the guy personally, and I think he'll fit in this locker room. And he's the type of player this team needs to make a cup run. And I think that's why I like this move so much, is because Ron Hextall knows this player so well. And I think Ron Hextall is a very good GM.
So, that's absolutely fair. That's kind of what I was looking for. So I'd say I'm in between a direct win and indifferent. We'll see, because the Penguins are just an enigma of their own, right? In terms of just how this team continues to operate at such a high level. We'll move on to the Boston Bruins, who had themselves an interesting 24 hours, an interesting couple of hours, going from getting absolutely punted 8-1 by the Washington Capitals. Yes. And immediately afterwards, they do acquire Mike Riley from the Ottawa Senators for a third-round pick next year, as well as acquiring Curtis Lazar and Taylor Hall from the Buffalo Sabres for Anders Bjork and a second-round pick this year. So for the Bruins, they have all of their draft picks aside from the second and third that they gave up in these trades. So they're still set up well that way. They pretty much utilized all of their cap space and addressed their absolute biggest needs. Another defenseman to get into the mix, because on top of course, letting Krug and Chara go, they've had a lot of injury troubles. Again, McAvoy and Carlo currently out. John Moore is out for the year. It kind of sucks, I mean, I get, like, these guys are decent, but I know even for you, Deej, to know that Connor Clifton, Jack Akan, Steven Kampfer, Jakob Zaboral, and Jared Tenorti, that these are some of the guys regularly getting playing time right now. Granted, Jack Akan's a emergency.
I've definitely heard of more than half those guys.
See, that's the point.
For sure. Definitely heard of more than half of them.
They needed an addition on defense, and they got it with Mike Riley, which, again, I threw out the word enigma. I'll do it again. He is a very interesting player, where we talk about wild cards on the Panthers. Mike Riley's a wild card for Boston. We just don't know. Might he fit into what the Torrey Krug, role once was? Maybe he will, and if he does, I'm very happy about that. But then you get to the biggest need that they had, and that was some goddamn scoring up front, and they got it. And Taylor Hall, from what we know, basically said, I'm coming here. And thank God he did, because I really thought the Bruins would end up with like a Jeff Carter or a Dustin Brown, and it's just more of the same. Now, again, the great fog of Buffalo. How cooked is Taylor Hall, if at all? We're going to find out. But it's announced, tonight the Bruins play. He looks like he's going to be on the second line with David Krejci and Craig Smith. Craig Smith, 22 points in 38 games. Krejci with 23 and 35. So, it's nice, because in theory now, the Bruins lines, Marchand, Bergeron, Pasternak. I like it, obviously. Hall, Krejci, Smith. I like it. Nick Ritchie, Charlie Coyle, Jake DeBrusk as a third line. If that line clicks, holy hell, do you suddenly have some good depth now? And the fourth line is lining up as Corrali, Lazar, and Wagner, which I love as a fourth line grind line. Giving up Anders Bjork kind of sucks, but it's just clear he was on the outs here, and he wasn't really going to fit, unfortunately. So for the Bruins to, get essentially a lesser version of Bjork in the form of Lazar, I'm cool with that, because again, you get Taylor Hall for the top six, which it's crazy to me. I mean, obviously there's the comparisons of Tyler and how they had Sagan, but there have just been some Bruins in the past decade where I'm like, what the hell?
Tyler, Eric.
What? Jesus, Deej. There have just been some guys in the Bruins where I'm like, what the hell? How is Jaromir Jagr, Rick Nash, Brian Gianna, and Taylor Hall how have they all suited up for the Bruins? It's incredibly bizarre. But yeah, I am very optimistic about this team. It's tough not to be. You do have the issues of goaltending. Some people thought, go get a goalie, but no, they have 4 guys who can play NHL time, including one Jeremy Swayman, which obviously I'm happy about. I mean, yeah, in terms of optimism about the Bruins keeping a playoff spot, I get the memes about Taylor Hall are there. The Bruins are keeping a playoff spot, and the Bruins can do some damage in the playoffs, absolutely. So it's 1,000% a thumbs up for me.
Well, so there is something I want to talk about in this trade, and that is Curtis Lazar. And Curtis Lazar fascinates me because he is the only player on the Buffalo Sabres this year that performed as expected.
Fair.
I mean, he's good for 20 points a year. He has 9 points in 33 games, including 5 goals. Like, somehow, whatever's wrong with Buffalo, they weren't putting it in Curtis Lazar's water.
That's one way to phrase it. So, yeah, maybe I should be even more optimistic about him then, huh?
I mean, he legitimately could be like a second line scorer if the fog of Buffalo theory is correct, you know? Like, I mean, he put up 9 points on a team where 9 points is good for top 10 in scoring.
So, yeah, overall, I'm excited. I'm happy. We'll see what happens tonight, but there should be less of a sense of dread around this team. Time will tell. Then you get, again, I talked about the division setup right now. The Bruins, 39 games, 48 points. The Rangers are just 4 points behind them, as are the Flyers. The Bruins have 2 games in hand on both of them. So the Rangers theoretically are back in it, but they did nothing for the deadline. Nothing in the month of April, which I would say is smart. You know, $10 million in cap space, but they just kind of stuck with it. They don't really have too many pieces that you'd look to sell. Actually, really looking at their lineup, they don't have anybody I think that you would look to sell here. You're not going to get anything for Brendan Smith or Phil DeGiuseppe. So the Rangers stood pat, as they should. I'm going to go indifferent. I can't really hand them a loss. I mean, Deej, the biggest news about the Rangers, unless you had something else to add, although I will point out, the Rangers and their buyout history on cap front, they have about $13 million in dead cap this year. That goes down to just $4 million next year. So this is a team that's set up very well. They have the majority of their draft picks. They still have that young squad. They're going to have a lot of cap room to play with. So good on Jeff Gordon for holding pat here. But the biggest news was with Tony DeAngelo.
Yeah. I will say, with nobody to trade, I do think it's interesting that nobody kicked the tires on Jack Johnson, considering Eric Goodbranson got moved.
Fair enough. I mean, he might have been the most notable name there.
Yeah, I mean, they didn't have anybody to sell. Yes, the Tony DeAngelo probably made a smart move for Tony DeAngelo for once, maybe.
Yeah.
It's really hard to say.
So for those that don't know, the New York Rangers offered to mutually terminate Tony DeAngelo's contract for the reason of him then being able to sign with any team he wants. And apparently Montreal was interested, and DeAngelo said no. Now, he said no, of course, because he's never going to make that same amount of money again, more than likely. Well, he's getting canceled. Shut up. Nobody cares about your opinion. At the end of the day, it's a smart move for Tony DeAngelo to take the money. At the end of the day, it's a real questionable move for the Montreal Canadiens to have expressed interest, and I will tell you why. No, it's not because Tony DeAngelo is a Republican, but for a team that shipped off, PK Subban because of potential locker room stuff. Boy, isn't it interesting how, but Tony DeAngelo, will take him. Some people are doing the whole, just saying about that. But, that's not out of nowhere. It's an interesting little tidbit is how I'll label it.
Yeah.
Nowhere to go on that one.
Yeah, it's an interesting tidbit. I don't know. If I'm Tony DeAngelo, I don't understand where there's obviously you're making less money because they're not buying you out of your contract, but why not go somewhere where there's definitely something lost in translation where you might not look like a dick. That was your out. There's nowhere else in the NHL you can hide.
Yeah, I don't even know. We'll move on to the Philadelphia Flyers, who were in a very interesting spot of do you buy or do you sell? And they sold a little bit, sending Michael Raffl to Washington for a 5th this year and Eric Gustafsson to Montreal for a 7th next year. And that was it, which $6.5 million in cap space, a team that you might have expected. I mean, granted, it's after those trades, but a team that you might have expected to maybe buy at the start of the season. Again, I thought a cup contender, and they're on the outs currently, which is still just absurd to think. I think right now for Chuck Fletcher, this is more of a, well, to Mr. Vigneault, we can't buy because of what we've seen. We're not going to sell because of what you should be. You have a month to turn this around, or you're probably fired, bud. And I mean, Alain Vigneault is signed until 2024, $5 million a year. So I don't know if the Flyers even move on. Like, if you don't move on from Vigneault because you don't want to pay him, that means you're moving on from certain players, which I think would be a mistake. So if there's a positive for Philly right now, you have basically all of your draft picks. You're set up there. None of your key players have expiring deals with the exception of Travis Sanheim, who's an RFA, and Carter Hart, who has screwed himself out of a lot of money. So you're not in cap hell. You have all your picks. It's a very similar situation to what we talked about before. It's it's a meh for the deadline. It's not a loss, but there are some questions about this team moving forward.
Yeah, the only thing I find very interesting is that they did not get rid of one of Brian Elliott or Alex Lyon or Alex Leone. I don't know how he pronounces it, but given that there is an extreme, so there's an obvious need in this trade deadline market that's now closed, but there was an obvious need for backup goaltenders, and here are the Philadelphia Flyers with two of them. They're flush with backup goalies. I mean, neither Brian Elliott or Alex Lyon performed so bad that they were untradeable. I think that's interesting. I don't necessarily count it as a mark against them, but when all three of your goalies have contracts coming up, nothing's really working there, and that goalie room is going to look very different, save for Carter Hart next year. I find it interesting that you didn't at least try to get like a third or a fourth.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think they fit, perfectly into that indifferent kind of territory. It's just one of those situations where you say, what the hell is even going on here? How is it this bad? To the point where Eric Gustafsson was traded for a seventh and Flyers fans were rejoicing. It's been a nightmare for them. It's not, it's not can't clear my throat. Not an insurmountable, there we go. Not an insurmountable setup there.
Nice.
We're leaving that in. This is what happens when old Tougie doesn't bring a third bottle of water. It's not an insurmountable setup here. They can overcome this and still make the playoffs, even if it's at Boston's expense. But it's just been a nightmare season for them. We'll move on to the penultimate team of this breakdown here, the New Jersey Devils, who were rather busy this month. Of course, the Palmieri Zajac trade, acquiring Siegenthaler for a third, and Dmitry Kulikov, they got a fourth rounder for him. So on one hand, again, I love the Palmieri Zajac deal for them, getting a first round pick out of it. A third rounder for Siegenthaler seems like a lot for me personally. I don't know. And Kulikov for a fourth, or Kulikov for a fourth, not bad, but it was just okay for New Jersey. And I mean, they have a ton of cap space. They have 2 first-round picks this year now. They're set up pretty well draft pick-wise. And really, outside of a Ryan Murray, an Aaron Dell, or a Scott Wedgwood, maybe even a Connor Carrick, there really wasn't anybody else, I think, that you were going to be looking at to get rid of here on this team. So I think for the most part, they could have, much like Detroit, done one extra move, maybe. I'm not going to hold that against them. It's just obviously a team that wasn't ready for the playoffs. They're not there yet, but they're set up very well for the future, and they had an okay deadline. I'm not going to say it's a outright thumbs up, but I mean, I don't know. Maybe getting a first-round pick, it is worthy of a thumbs up, but somewhere in between, a thumbs to the northeast is how I'm going to phrase it.
I don't know if they could have gotten a first. But you gotta wonder if this team shopped Ryan Murray.
He's just such a tough player to talk about, though, because it's just always the injury concerns with him. Every time.
Yeah.
Like, he is really good, unless his metrics have dropped off this year, and they have a little bit. But could that just be the New Jersey effect? But as a defenseman, he's solid. It's just that guy cannot stay healthy.
No, he can't at all. And I mean, he is a UFA on the book, so you end up with kind of nothing for him. But I'm surprised that the tires weren't kicked a little bit more on Ryan Murray.
Kick those tires, hurt foot, 6 weeks on the IR. We move over to our final team here as we look to wrap up this podcast here. Over 2 hours, I'm sure. It's the Buffalo Sabres, who, again, we've already talked about their 2 deals. A 3rd-round pick for Montour, Bjork, and a 2nd for Taylor Hall and Curtis Lazar. I know a lot of people are quick to label the Sabres as losers here. I don't think so, despite every fiber of my being saying that they are. Again, they were really handcuffed with the Taylor Hall trade, and getting something from Montour is fine. Could they have sold off a tiny bit more? Maybe. But, like, who's going after Toby Reeder, Riley Shea, and Matt Irwin? The big question mark is what's going on with Linus Hallmark. And if they're going to be able to work out an extension for him, and if not, then yes, it would have been better to trade him. And you could have at least gotten a 3rd like Calgary did for Riddick. So it's a tough one, but I fail to label Buffalo as losers here. They're not winners, certainly. I have them in the middle. And they are still set up with a ton of cap space and draft picks for the next couple of years, but obviously they have a lot of expiring contracts this year too.
Yeah. I'll call them winners on the deadline, even though that's difficult just because of the just absolute mountain of trash that they need to climb over to get this franchise functional again.
Trash mountain.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what you do. But yeah, okay. All right, the deadline was a step in the right direction.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess in conclusion here, I mean, again, you can kind of tell our big winners. I mean, obviously Toronto stands out. Detroit stands out. Colorado as well. I mean, Tampa. There are a lot of teams that did very well here. Still, the biggest losers to me that come to mind, I mean, Carolina. Carolina might be the top out of all the potential losers here at this stage. I just can't help but think that they may have made a pretty drastic mistake. But hey, like we mentioned, Dom Waddell at the helm. Who's to say what will happen? I mean, that's, again, out of anybody that you want leading your team, he's up there for sure.
Yeah. We'll see. We'll see how this Central shakes out. We got the Panthers mystery box. We got Nashville staying lukewarm. We got Carolina doing absolutely nothing. We got Chicago making good decisions. So the Central is the most interesting of all these and everything that happened. All in all, trade deadline, given that it's an abbreviated season and we only had 30, 40 games going into this deadline, significantly more exciting than I thought it would have been. I thought there would not be a lot of moves because teams wouldn't want to be buyers or sellers based on an abbreviated season. I was very wrong.
Yeah, no, me too. I expected this to be boring as hell. And it's nice. You got, a lot of those kind of middle of the road trades that could make a difference. Like you mentioned, the mystery boxes. We got a home run of a trade at the end. It was interesting and has kind of renewed my interest. Not that I wasn't interested to begin with, but I'm certainly more locked on here to what this is going to be now in the back half, the final month of the season and how it's going to play out. So with that, again, Deej and I will be back later on in the week. Real busy time for me personally, but we're going to do the best that we can. We'll get your viewer questions back and talk about everything that's gone on basically in the past week up to that day that we didn't get to talk about here on this show. So make sure to stay tuned there. And of course, the bonus Patreon episode will be back this week as well. Don't think that we have forgotten about you. You can follow myself on Twitter. Of course, you see on the screen at Tougie24, and of course, everywhere at Tougie24. Of course, YouTube, Twitch, and the likes. Deej on Twitter at DEJ1088. Deej, your final thoughts for this week. Sum up the deadline and bring us into the final month of the regular season.
Sum up the deadline. The rich got richer. Pierre LeBrun recently said that the double retentions are here to stay. are here to stay. And God, I hope not.
Suck it, Toronto.
Yeah, right?
All
I
right.
can't even say anything bad about Toronto. They're horrifying right now. They're super scary.
They really are.
All they needed to do was have Freddie Anderson fake an injury, and now they're Stanley Cup contenders.
Fredidas Island. We have a
Indeed.
title. God, that's beautiful.